She had no sword. She had no army. She had no throne.
She had nothing.
Except the hands that prepared his meals every single day. And one morning, he was dead. The court pointed at her immediately. The crowd outside screamed her name like a curse. The judges never even looked her in the eye before they wrote the word. Guilty. They stripped her of everything. Her dignity, her voice, her future. They made her a monster in every story they told. But here is what they never told you. She did not do it. And somewhere, buried beneath centuries of lies, beneath sealed court documents, beneath the graves of people who knew the truth and stayed silent, the real story was waiting. It was always waiting. And today, we are going to tell it. From the very beginning. There are some lives that the world decides are small, before they even begin.
She was born in a village,
so forgotten by history that even its name has faded from the oldest maps. A place where the roads turned to mud in winter and dust in summer. A place where people worked until their backs broke and their hands bled, and called it a blessing simply because they were still alive. Her name was Mara, not a queen's name. Not a name carved into marble or whispered in royal courts. Just Mara. A simple name for a girl the world had already decided would live a simple, invisible life. Her father was a laborer. A man who carried stone and timber for the homes of wealthy merchants, and came home each night smelling of sweat and defeat. He was not a cruel man, but he was a broken one, and broken men pass their fractures down to their children whether they mean to or not. Her mother was different. Her mother was the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of grief and somehow make the air feel lighter. She had eyes that caught light like still water. She had hands that were always moving, always working, always creating something from nothing. She taught Mara everything, how to read in secret, because girls in that village were not supposed to read. How to mix herbs for medicine, because the nearest doctor was 3 days away by horse. How to stay quiet when powerful people spoke, and how to listen so carefully that you heard not just their words, but the truth hiding behind them. The world will try to make you small. Mara, her mother used to say, pressing her daughter's small face between her rough palms. Do not help it. Mara was 12 years old when her mother died. A fever, fast and merciless, the kind that gave no warning and asked no permission. And just like that, the warmest thing in Mara's world was gone. Her father tried. He truly did. But grief has a way of hollowing people out from the inside. He started drinking, slowly at first, then completely. The little money they had trickled away like water through cracked fingers. By the time Mara was 14, there was nothing left. No money, no food, no future. And so, her father made the only decision a desperate man could think of. He sold her contract to a labor broker from the city. Not slavery, not exactly, but close enough that the difference barely mattered. She would work in a wealthy household. She would cook, clean, serve, and be grateful for the roof above her head. She would send what little she earned back to her father. And she would do all of this, without complaint, without resistance, without ever forgetting her place. Mara sat in the back of a wooden cart as it rolled away from everything she had ever known. She did not cry. She had already used up all her tears when her mother died. She simply watched the village disappear behind her. And she made herself a quiet promise. She would survive this. Whatever this was, she would survive it. The city appeared on the horizon like something from a dream she had never been allowed to have. Towers of stone, streets paved with cobblestone, carriages pulled by horses so well fed they looked like creatures from another world entirely. And above it all, rising at the edge of the city like a crown sitting on the skull of something ancient, the estate of Lord Aldrich Voss, the man who would become her master, the man whose death would destroy her life. But that night, as the cart rolled through the iron gates of the estate, Mara knew none of that. She only knew that the walls were high, the guards were watching, and the door that closed behind her closed like the lid of a box. In next, we step inside the estate. We meet the master, and we begin to understand that in this house, behind all its gold and silk and candlelight, Something very dark was already growing. If this story already has you hooked, share it with someone who loves powerful hidden history. Drop a comment below telling me, do you think she was innocent? And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit that bell, because this story is only just beginning. And trust me, you cannot miss what comes next. There is a particular kind of beautiful that is also dangerous, the kind that makes you forget to be careful. The estate of Lord Aldrich Voss was exactly that kind of beautiful. From the outside, it looked like something painted by an artist who had never known hunger. Every stone was carved with precision. Every window was lined with glass so clear it looked like frozen air. The gardens stretched in perfect symmetry, roses in rows so straight they seemed afraid to grow crooked. And inside was another world entirely. Marble floors that reflected candlelight like still lakes. Ceilings painted with scenes of gods and battles and triumphant kings. Hallways lined with portraits of Voss ancestors, each one staring down at the servants below with the same cold, appraising eyes. Mara arrived with nothing but a small cloth bundle and the clothes on her back. The head housekeeper, a thin, precise woman named Elsa, who moved like a shadow and spoke like a sentence that had never once been interrupted, looked Mara up and down for exactly 3 seconds. "You will speak only when spoken to," Elsa said. "You will eat what is given to you. You will sleep when the work is done. And you will never, under any circumstances, enter the East Wing without permission." "What is in the East Wing?" Mara asked. Elsa stared at her for a long moment. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly the kind of question that gets girls like you sent back." Where they came from, Mara learned quickly. She learned that the kitchen was her kingdom and her cage at the same time. She learned that the other servants had been there so long, they had stopped wondering about things that did not concern them. She learned that in this house, silence was not just a habit, it was armor. Lord Aldrich Voss himself was not what she had expected. He was older than she had imagined, perhaps 60, with silver hair swept back from a face that had once been handsome and was now simply powerful. He had the kind of presence that changed the weight of a room when he entered it. Servants straightened. Conversation stopped. Even the air seemed to tighten slightly. He was not openly cruel. That was the most dangerous thing about him. Cruel men are easy to understand. You know where you stand with a man who shouts and strikes. But Aldrich Voss was something far more unsettling. He was unpredictable. Some mornings he would stop in the kitchen doorway and compliment the smell of the bread. He would speak to Mara almost like a human being, asking where she was from, whether she had family, whether she found the work difficult. And then other mornings, he would walk past her as though she were part of the furniture. Less than furniture, as though she were simply a function, a pair of hands attached to nothing that mattered. Mara watched him, carefully, the way her mother had taught her. And she began to notice things. She noticed that he had visitors who came at night and left before dawn. Men in fine clothes who never announced themselves at the front gate, but always seemed to know which side entrance to use. Men whose faces were familiar from the portraits in the city hall. Politicians. The judges, men whose names appeared in the weekly broadsheets, next to words like honorable and distinguished. She noticed that after these visits, Lord Voss was always different the next morning. Tighter, more wound, like a clock that had been overwound and was in danger of breaking its own spring. She noticed the East Wing, how sometimes, late at night, a light burned there that had no reason to burn. How sometimes she heard voices from behind that sealed door that sounded like arguing, but stopped the moment anyone walked near. And she noticed one more thing. Lord Voss had a nephew. His name was Dorian, and Dorian Voss was the most dangerous kind of man in the world. The kind who smiled at everyone and meant it for no one. He was perhaps 30, lean and well-dressed, with charm that he wore as casually as other men wore coats. He had recently returned from years abroad, or so the story went. He moved through the estate like a man who was measuring it, like a man who was calculating something. He watched Mara, too, not the way some men watched female servants, with entitlement and contempt. He watched her the way you watch someone you might one day need, or one day use. You're the new kitchen girl, he said to her one evening, stopping in the corridor as she carried a tray of evening tea. Yes, sir, she answered, keeping her eyes down. My uncle speaks well of you, he said. He says you have a careful hand with spices.
I try to please, sir.
He smiled. And something about that smile made Mara's stomach turn in a way she could not explain. I'm sure you do, he said softly, and walked away. That night, Mara lay in her small room in the servants' quarters and stared at the ceiling. The estate glittered around her like a jewel box. But jewel boxes, she had learned, always had locks, and she was beginning to understand that she was not the one holding the key. In Next the Night, everything changed. Lord Voss sits down to his evening meal, and by morning he will never sit down again. The trap is being set, but who is really setting it? Comment below with your theory. Is Dorian involved? Share this story because it's only getting darker from here. And subscribe right now so you don't miss part 3. Because the night Lord Voss dies changes everything. It was an ordinary evening. That is the thing about the nights that change everything. They never announce themselves. They arrive dressed as Tuesday, dressed as routine, dressed as just another quiet evening in a house, full of quiet people doing quiet things. The fires were lit, the candles were burning. The smell of roasted meat and herbs moved through the corridors like a slow, comfortable ghost. Mara had been cooking since midday. Lord Voss had requested a specific meal that evening. A dish he had eaten as a child, he had told Elsa. A slow braised lamb with black pepper and dried fig, served with a particular bread that Mara had learned to bake in the weeks since her arrival. She had worked carefully, precisely, the way she always worked. She tasted everything herself, as she always did, because Elsa had taught her that a cook who does not taste her own food is a cook who cannot be trusted. The meal was ready at exactly the time it was always ready. She placed it on the silver tray. She arranged it the way she had been taught, and she carried it to the dining room where Lord Voss sat alone, as he often did on Tuesday evenings, with a glass of red wine and a book open beside his plate. He looked up when she entered. Smells right, he said, which from him was the same as a standing ovation. Thank you, my lord, she said. She set the tray down. She poured his wine. She stepped back. You may go, he said, and she went. She returned to the kitchen. She cleaned. She prepared the servant's meal. She ate a small portion in the corner of the kitchen the way she always did, quietly, quickly, then washed her bowl and set it to dry. The evening moved on. It was 3 hours later when the screaming started. Not Mara's scream, not yet. It was one of the upstairs maids, a young girl named Petra, who had gone to collect Lord Voss's empty tray. She found him slumped in his chair. The book had fallen to the floor. The wine glass had tipped and bled a dark red stain across the white tablecloth, and Lord Aldrich Voss sat with his head back and his eyes open and his chest completely, terribly still. The sound Petra made was not quite human. It brought everyone running. By the time Mara reached the dining room doorway, the room was already crowded with servants. Elsa was pressing 2 fingers against Lord Voss's neck with the practiced calm of someone who already knew what she would not find. The footman was at the window shouting into the night for the guards, and in the corner of the room, Dorian Voss stood very, very still. He was already there, already dressed, though it was nearly midnight. Already present in a room he had no reason to be in at that particular moment, as though he had been waiting. He looked at the body of his uncle, and then he looked at Mara, and his expression did not change. That was the thing that she would remember for the rest of her life. That was the detail that carved itself into her memory like a wound that never healed. He did not look shocked. He did not look grief-stricken. He looked at her, and he looked almost relieved. The physician arrived within the hour, a man named Dr. Holt with white whiskers and slow, deliberate hands. He examined the body for a long time without speaking. He sniffed the air near Lord Voss's mouth. He lifted the eyelids. He studied the color of the lips and the stiffness of the hands. Then he stood up, straightened his coat, and said 3 words that sealed Mara's fate. He was poisoned. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mara had ever heard. Every head in the room turned, slowly, inevitably, like a tide that could not be stopped. They all turned to her. The girl from the kitchen, the one who had cooked his meal, the one who had touched every ingredient, every spice, every portion that had passed through Lord Voss's lips in the final hours of his life. She prepared the meal, Elsa said, not with cruelty, but with the flat, toneless certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. She was the last to serve him, added Petra from the corner, her voice still shaking from the scream. Mara stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides. She looked at Dr. Holt. She looked at Elsa. She looked at the guards who had entered and were now moving toward her with the slow, heavy purpose of men who had already decided what they were doing. And she looked at Dorian Voss one final time. He met her eyes for just a moment. And then he looked away. That was all it took. They took her that night. They did not ask her questions. They did not listen to her words. They walked her through the grand hallways of the estate that had been her cage for months. And they pushed her through a different door, a door that opened onto the cold night air in a waiting carriage with iron handles on the inside. Mara climbed in. The door shut. The lock turned. And somewhere above the city, the stars kept burning as though nothing in the world had changed at all. In next the trial, the courtroom, the judges who had already made up their minds before she even opened her mouth. The most devastating injustice of this entire story begins now. You felt that, didn't you? That moment when Dorian looked away. Comment what you think he knew. Share this with everyone. This story deserves to be heard. And subscribe right now because part 4, the trial, is going to break your heart. They gave her 3 days in a cell before the trial. 3 days of cold stone and thin light, and the distant sound of a city that had already forgotten she existed. They brought her bread and water twice a day. They did not bring her a lawyer. They did not bring her anyone who might help her form the words she would need. When they finally put her in front of the court, what they did bring her, on the second night, was a man, not a god, not a lawyer, a man in a grey coat who sat down across from her, in the dim light of her cell, and folded his hands on the table between them as though they were about to share a civilized conversation. He did not give her his name. "This will go easier for you," he said quietly, "if you simply confess." Mara looked at him steadily. "Confess to what?" "To what you did." "I did nothing," she said. He tilted his head slightly, like a man who had heard this exact sentence many times before and found it only mildly interesting. "The evidence is considerable," he said. "The physician's report, the testimony of the other servants, your access to the kitchen, your access to the spices." "Anyone in that house had access to the kitchen," Mara said. "But not everyone prepared his meal that night," said the man in the grey coat. "You did." He stood up, straightened his coat, moved toward the door. "Think carefully," he said without turning around. "A confession now means a lesser sentence. Silence means something much worse." The door closed. Mara sat in the dark, and she understood clearly for the first time exactly what kind of trap she was sitting in. The trial began on a grey Thursday morning. The courtroom was a high-ceilinged room that smelled of old wood and authority. 3 judges sat at an elevated bench that had been built specifically to ensure that whoever stood below it always felt small. The gallery was half full with city people, who had come the way people always come to trials, involving death and scandal. Mara was brought in wearing the plain grey dress they had given her. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were unbound, but she had been told clearly that any sudden movement would be treated as aggression. She stood straight. She had promised herself that. Whatever else happened, she would stand straight. The charges were read in a voice that carried the practiced boredom of a man who read charges every day and had long since stopped thinking of the people attached to them as human beings. Willful and deliberate murder, by poison of Lord Aldrich Voss, premeditated, carried out through the abuse of a position of trust. The prosecution spoke first. He was a broad man with a voice like a funeral bell. He laid out the case with the confidence of someone who already knew the verdict and was simply performing the ritual of earning it. Mara had cooked the meal. Mara had served the meal. The physician had confirmed poison. The other servants had confirmed that no one else had entered the kitchen. In the hours before the meal was served, she had motive, the prosecutor said, turning to face the gallery with the dramatic flair of a man who enjoyed his work enormously. She had been heard arguing with Lord Voss 3 days before his death over her working conditions. She had access to the means. She had the opportunity, and she had the audacity, to stand here today and claim innocence. He said the word innocence the way you might say the name of something you had long ago stopped believing in. The gallery murmured. Mara's appointed defender was a young man, barely older than she was, who had the look of someone who had been handed this case the day before and had not slept since. He asked 3 questions. Mara answered all 3 clearly and calmly. She had not poisoned Lord Voss. She had tasted the food herself before serving it. She had seen Dorian Voss already present in the room when the body was found. That last point made the young defender look up from his papers with something close to alertness. "You are saying that Dorian Voss was already in the room?" he asked. "Yes," Mara said, before anyone had called for him. Before anyone had informed him of what had happened. He was already there. A ripple moved through the gallery. One of the 3 judges leaned forward. "That is a serious accusation," he said. "Do you have evidence to support this claim?"
I have my own eyes, Mara said.
The judge leaned back. "The testimony of a servant," he said slowly, "against the character of a man of established standing, will require considerably more than personal observation." And just like that, the door was closed. 3 witnesses were called for the prosecution. All 3 were servants from the estate. All 3 confirmed that Mara had prepared the meal. All 3 confirmed that she had been the last person to handle the food before it reached Lord Voss. Not one of them mentioned Dorian. Not one of them mentioned the late-night visitors. Not one of them mentioned the light in the east wing. Later, years later, 2 of those 3 servants would be found living in considerably improved circumstances, new homes, stable incomes, situations that had no obvious explanation given what they earned in service. But that was later. That day, in that courtroom, the judges conferred for 40 minutes. 40 minutes, that was all the time it took to decide the fate of a human life. When they returned, the lead judge sat down, adjusted the papers before him, and looked at Mara for the first and only time during the entire proceedings. "The court finds the defendant guilty." The gallery erupted. Mara heard the sound from very far away, like it was happening in another room, in another life. She stood straight. She had promised herself that. And as they took her arms and turned her toward the door, she looked one last time at the gallery, scanning the faces, searching. Dorian Voss was not there. Of course he wasn't. Men who win rarely need to watch. And next, we leave the courtroom and go somewhere else entirely. We follow the money, we follow the motive, and we begin to uncover the shadow network behind Lord Voss's death that Mara never had the power to expose, but that history slowly, quietly, inexorably revealed. To understand who killed Lord Aldrich Voss, you have to understand what Lord Aldrich Voss was worth, not in terms of his character, not in terms of what kind of man he was, in terms of what he owned. The Voss estate was not simply a large house with pretty gardens. It was the visible surface of something much larger and much darker. Lord Voss controlled 3 of the most productive grain trading routes in the region. He held contracts with the city's main port authority. He owned land that sat directly above one of the richest underground water sources in the province. He was not just wealthy. He was strategically wealthy, the kind of wealthy that makes powerful men nervous. And for the last 2 years of his life, Lord Aldrich Voss had been quietly, carefully keeping records. Not the kind of records a businessman keeps for accounting purposes. The other kind. Names, dates, payments, arrangements that were never meant to be written down. Deals made in darkened rooms between men whose public reputations depended entirely on no one ever knowing. what they had agreed to. Lord Voss had attended those rooms. He had been part of those arrangements. But somewhere along the line, something had shifted in him. Whether it was conscience or fear or simply the calculating instinct of a man who understood leverage better than most, he had started writing it all down. The late-night visitors that Mara had noticed were not business associates. They were men who had come to negotiate. To convince Lord Voss that his records should quietly disappear, he had refused. He had not refused loudly, not dramatically, not in the way that heroes refuse in stories. He had refused the way careful, intelligent men refuse things they know are dangerous, slowly, evasively, buying time while deciding what to do next. He had been deciding for too long, and the men he was refusing had run out of patience. Among those men was a city magistrate named Harlow, a man whose signature appeared on Mara's conviction papers, a man who had been one of Lord Voss's regular late-night visitors in the months before his death. And among those men was a business partner whose interests were directly threatened by the Port Authority contracts that Lord Voss controlled. A man named Dorian Voss, not a nephew by blood. That detail took historians nearly a century to confirm. Dorian had been legally adopted into the Voss family name 15 years earlier, under circumstances that themselves were never entirely clear. He had no natural claim to the estate, no guaranteed inheritance, no certainty of receiving anything upon Aldrich Voss's death, unless the will was read in a very particular way. And the will, as it turned out, had been modified. 3 months before Lord Voss died, a new version of his will had been drafted and signed by a notary who was also, conveniently, a close associate of Magistrate Harlow. In this new version, Dorian Voss inherited everything: the estate, the grain routes, the port contracts, the land, all of it. The older version of the will, the one written in Lord Voss's own hand years earlier, had divided the estate between 3 different charitable institutions and a distant family member living abroad. Dorian received nothing in that version. Nothing. And yet somehow, a new will appeared, signed and sealed and perfectly legal on paper. 3 months before a man with every reason to distrust Dorian suddenly died of poison. This was the shadow that Mara could not see from her place in the kitchen. This was the architecture of the trap she had walked into without ever knowing a trap had been built. But there was someone who saw it. His name was Father Clement, a church archivist who had spent 40 years recording the legal and financial histories of the city's most prominent families. He was not an investigator. He was not a journalist. He was simply a precise, meticulous old man who believed that records existed to be accurate, and who noticed in the months following Lord Voss's death that several documents he had personally catalogued had been altered. Subtle changes, the kind that only someone who had seen the originals would catch. A date shifted, a signature beside a different name, a clause added to a contract in ink that did not quite match the ink surrounding it. Father Clement said nothing publicly. He was not a brave man. He was a frightened, careful old man who understood exactly what had happened to the last person, who had stood between these men and what they wanted. But he kept copies, hidden in a place no one would think to look. Inside the back covers of church ledgers going back 30 years, pressed flat and sealed with a thin layer of wax. He kept copies of everything, and he wrote one letter. Not to the court, not to the magistrate, not to any official body that these men already controlled. He wrote it to a historian in another city, a woman he had corresponded with for years on matters of archival record. A woman who had no connection to this city, no vulnerability to these men, and no reason to stay silent. He sealed the letter. He sent it through a church messenger, and he prayed. He was dead within the year. Natural causes, the official record stated. But the letter had already arrived, and the woman who received it did not stay silent. In Next we follow the letter. We follow the truth as it travels across time, through closed doors and locked archives, surviving every attempt to bury it, until it can no longer be ignored. A hidden will, a fake nephew, a terrified archivist with the courage to save one letter. This story is real in every way that matters. Comment Father Clement if this part hit you. Share this, because people need to know what real power looks like when it hides. And subscribe. Part 6 is where the tide finally begins to turn. Her name was Professor Elise Maren. She was 43 years old, unmarried by choice, widely respected in academic circles, and absolutely unafraid of powerful men. She had spent her career doing the work that most historians considered unglamorous. The slow, painstaking recovery of voices that official records had chosen to erase. When Father Clement's letter arrived at her office, she read it 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long while. Then she began working. She could not go to the courts. Magistrate Harlow still sat on his bench. The system that had convicted Mara was still intact and still, functional and still, fully capable of burying whatever she brought to it. So she went somewhere else. She went to the archives. Not the city archives. Not the official records that had been so carefully adjusted by people who knew how adjustments were made. She went to the church archives, to private family collections, to the estate records of neighbouring landowners who had done business with Lord Voss, to the Port Authority's own internal shipping logs, which had never been considered important enough to falsify. She spent 2 years gathering, and piece by piece, the picture assembled itself. The modified will, the identical handwriting of 2 supposedly different notaries that turned out to be one man with 2 false identities. The payments from Dorian Voss to a chemist in the lower city. Payments made in the months before Lord Voss's death and never appearing in any official financial record. The chemist himself had died, but his supply ledger had been kept by his daughter, who had no idea what it contained and had stored it in a trunk for 15 years simply because it had been her father's. In that ledger, an entry, unsigned but dated, a purchase of a compound that Dr. Holt had never been asked about during Mara's trial. A compound that was tasteless, odorless, undetectable by the examination methods available at the time, but whose effects matched exactly what Dr. Holt had observed. The proof that Mara had tasted the food herself and survived was not proof of her innocence, under the crude science of the trial, but under Maren's analysis. It was devastating, because the poison that killed Lord Voss was not something added to the food. It was something added to his wine. Wine that Mara had poured from the decanter kept in the east wing. Wine that Mara touched only at the table, only for a matter of seconds, and never consumed herself. Wine that had been sitting in that decanter since the day before, accessible to anyone with access to the east wing, access that Mara was explicitly forbidden from having, access that Dorian Voss had freely and completely. Maren published her findings in the form of a monograph, a long, precise, fully sourced academic document that circulated first in university libraries and then, slowly, in popular press. It caused a significant controversy. Several prominent defenders of the original trial wrote angry responses. Magistrate Harlow, now retired, called it a fabrication. But the documents existed. The ledger existed. The hidden copies in Father Clement's church ledgers were recovered and verified by 3 independent archivists, and Mara herself was still alive. She had served 14 years of her sentence before a changing political climate had led to a reduction of her confinement. She had been released not as an exonerated woman, but simply as one whose continued imprisonment had become inconvenient. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a door that opened one morning and a world outside that barely remembered her name. She had been living quietly in a small town far from the city, working, surviving the way she had always survived. When Maren found her, Mara was 51 years old. She had the same stillness she had carried into that courtroom, the same careful, observant eyes, the same habit of listening more than speaking. Maren told her what she had found. She showed her the documents, the ledger entry, the evidence of the modified will, the proof of the decanter and the East Wing wine. Mara listened to all of it without speaking. When Maren finished, there was a long silence. "I knew all of it," Mara said finally. "I knew from the moment I saw his face in that room. I knew what had happened, and I knew why, and I knew that knowing it would never be enough. It might be enough now, Maren said. Mara looked at her for a moment. For whom? She asked quietly. It was the most important question in the entire story, because Mara would never receive a formal exoneration in her lifetime. The courts did not move quickly enough. The political will was never quite sufficient. The men who had been responsible were dead, or too old, or too insulated by respectability to be meaningfully held to account. What she received instead was something different. She received the truth spoken out loud in the world. She received the acknowledgement of scholars and historians, and eventually, decades after her own death, a formal historical review that declared her conviction a miscarriage of justice. She received her name back, and sometimes that is the only justice history is able to offer. In next, the final part. We return to Mara one last time. We look at what her story left behind, and we ask the question this entire story has been building toward. What do we owe the people history has wronged? She knew, she always knew, and she survived anyway. Comment "she knew" if this gave you chills. Share this story, it deserves every single view. And subscribe right now because final is the ending, and it will stay with you long after this video ends. Mara died at the age of 67. In a small house with a garden that she had planted herself, with herbs growing in careful rows, beside the window and a shelf of books. Above the fireplace, many of which she had read in secret. As a girl under the teaching of a mother, the world had taken from her far too soon. She died without fanfare, without ceremony, without the apology she was owed. But she died as herself, and that is something they never managed to take from her permanently. The story of Mara's trial and conviction, and the evidence of her innocence, was eventually included in the curricula of 3 university law programs as a case study in institutional failure. Her name appears in the footnotes of several landmark legal reform documents. The city where she was tried eventually placed a small commemorative, a marker near the site of the old courthouse. Small things, quiet things. Not enough. Never quite enough, but present. There is a particular kind of injustice that operates not through violence or open cruelty, but through systems, through processes that appear legitimate, through courts and documents and official language that wraps the destruction of a human life in the dignified clothing of procedure. This is what happened to Mara. She was not destroyed by a single monstrous act. She was destroyed by a series of decisions made by people who told themselves they were simply doing their jobs. The physician who named poison without completing his analysis. The servants who stayed silent to protect their positions. The defender who was too inexperienced and too afraid to push harder. The judges who valued the word of a wealthy heir over the testimony of a kitchen girl. Each one a small failure. Together, a catastrophe. And Dorian Voss? He lived for 32 more years after Mara's conviction. He managed the Voss estate for most of that time, though his tenure was marked by declining revenues and a series of legal disputes that slowly eroded the fortune he had stolen. He died in debt, estranged from what remained of his social circle. His name does not appear on any commemorative marker. No university studies his decisions. History has its own quiet ways of settling accounts. But this story is not really about what happened to Dorian. It is about what happened to Mara. And more than that, it is about the 10,000 Maras. The ones whose stories did not have a Professor Maren to recover them. The ones whose father Clements lost their letters before they arrived. The ones whose ledgers were burned instead of stored. The ones who did not live long enough to hear their names spoken. Clearly in a world that had spent their entire lives pronouncing those names, like accusations. Every court that moves too quickly. Every verdict that arrives before the evidence does. Every system that decides the outcome based on who the accused is rather than what the accused did. Every one of those systems creates another Mara, creates another person who stands in a room full of people who have already decided and has to find a way to survive the decision. Mara found that way. Not through fire or vengeance or dramatic escape. Through the same thing her mother gave her in that small village on the road that no longer appears on any map. The refusal to be made small. The world will try to make you small, Mara. Do not help it. She didn't. She stood straight in that courtroom. She stood straight in that cell. She stood straight on the day a historian came to her door with documents and told her what she had always known. And she asked the most important question. For whom? For whom is justice done? For the living? For the dead? For the record? For the feeling of resolution that we need more than truth sometimes needs us to have it? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that this story asks us to sit with, because the easiest thing in the world is to hear a story like this one, feel the appropriate anger, feel the appropriate grief, and then move on. The harder thing, the thing that actually honors what Mara endured, is to ask where the systems that failed her still exist, where the courts still move too quickly, where the voices still get dismissed based on who they belong to, where the evidence still matters less than the conclusion. Someone powerful is already reached. Where right now, today, in this world, someone is standing in front of judges who have already decided and finding the strength to stand straight. That is Mara's legacy, not the marker outside the old courthouse, not the footnote in the law textbook, not even this story. Her legacy is the question she forces us to ask, and whether or not we are brave enough to answer it. That is tis tomb. She had no sword. She had no army. She had no throne. She had only the truth. And in the end, the truth was enough to outlive everything they built to bury it. That is tis tomb. And that is the full story of Mara, a woman history tried to erase and couldn't. If this story moved you, share it right now. Let the world hear her name. Drop a comment telling me what part hit you the hardest. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. Hit that button, ring that bell, because every story we tell here is a story someone tried to silence. We don't let that happen. See you in the next one.